The sun beat down relentlessly over the great expanse of savanna, tinging the horizon with hues of amber and gold. Valentin Marquez tipped his hat, squinting as he scanned the landscape. He had spent years dedicating himself to the rescue of abandoned and injured wildlife, but this day would mark the beginning of something extraordinary. He just didn't know it yet. A faint, complaining cry took his attention. It was barely discernible over the rustling grass, but Valentin's trained ears honed in on the sound. He cautiously approached a thicket, the crunch of the dry earth soft beneath the boots. Parting the heavy foliage, he froze in place. There, still and unmoving, was a very small lioness cub. Her fur dull and patchy, a view to her ribs standing out from her frail structure, stared back at him. Her eyes, half open, held a plea of defeat. "Oh no!" Valentin whispered. He crouched beside her, his heart breaking at the sight. Gently he scooped the cub into his arms. She barely reacted, her body limp with exhaustion. "You're not giving up on me," he murmured, determination flaring in his chest. "Not today!" Back at his modest home near the wildlife park he managed, Valentin set to work. The cub needed immediate care, and there was no time to waste. He prepared a makeshift bottle filled with a nutrient-rich milk formula and carefully fed her, drop by precious drop. First, she refused, her tiny body too weak to cooperate, but Valentin's patience never wavered. "Come on, little one," he coaxed softly. "You've got to fight. Just a little more." After hours of effort, she began taking those first tentative sips. As her breathing slowly began to steady, a glimmer of hope started to course through Valentin's frame. He resolved that her name would be Surga, after a certain warrior queen from a story that his grandmother used to narrate to him, appropriate as she would be in these situations. The next several weeks were a haze of sleepless nights and unending watchfulness. Surga started to fill in, the shine on her fur heavier, her eyes brighter, with each passing day. Valentin's attachment for her grew deeper. He was to be her caretaker and protector. One evening, as Valentin sat on the porch with Surga curled up at his feet, his closest friend and fellow conservationist, Leo, arrived. Leo's wide-brimmed hat and perpetually amused expression formed a curious contrast to Valentin's silent intensity. "So, this is the infamous Surga," Leo said, crouching to examine the cub. Surga blinked back at him unimpressed. "She's got a strong spirit," Valentin said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Reminds me of someone." Leo laughed. "She's lucky to have you. Most people wouldn't bother with a case this hopeless." Valentin's expression darkened. "Hopeless is what people say when they don't want to try. She deserves a chance." As Surga recovered her health, so did her personality. She became playful and inquisitive, pouncing on Valentin's boots or swatting at his hat with her already big paws. Despite such progress, Valentin knew she couldn't stay with him forever. She was a wild animal, and her future belonged in the savannah, not within the confines of his home. To prepare her, Valentin started teaching her survival skills. He took her on long walks through the wildlife park, teaching her how to stalk and pounce. At first, she was clumsy, and Leo often joined them, chuckling at her missteps. "She's more house-cat than lioness right now," Leo teased one afternoon as Surga leaped and missed a stationary log. "Give her time," Valentin replied, his tone even. "She'll surprise you." Not everyone shared Valentin's optimism, however. One vocal critic was Nigel Grayson, a wealthy land developer who saw the wildlife park as an obstacle to his plans. Nigel's arrogance was as expansive as his bank account, and he often dismissed Valentin's efforts as sentimental nonsense. "You're wasting your time with that cub," Nigel said one evening, dropping by uninvited. His tailored suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to the rustic simplicity of Valentin's home. "And you're wasting my time," Valentin shot back, unbothered by the man's presence. Nigel sneered, nodding toward Surga, who watched from the doorway with wary eyes. "That thing will never survive out there. You should just let nature take its course." Valentin's eyes narrowed. Nature already gave up on her once. "I'm not making the same mistake." Nigel's words gnawed at Valentin, but he refused to let doubt creep in. Serga's progress was proof enough that she could defy the odds. Still, there were challenges ahead, and Valentine knew the path wouldn't be easy. For now, he focused on each small victory, celebrating every step Serga took toward becoming the lioness she was meant to be. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Valentine watched Serga chase fireflies in the dying light. Her growls of play, her leaps clumsy, filled the air with a lightness he had not known in years. In that moment, a silent promise to her, she would live, no matter what. Unbeknownst to Valentine, Nigel was concocting a scheme. The land developer had his eyes on the wildlife park, and he would stop at nothing to get his hands on it. The more Serga grew in strength and character, the graver the threats against her started to become. This battle for Serga's future was only just about to begin. Valentine knew that the next phase of Serga's journey would test both of them. The lioness was no longer a frail cub, she was growing stronger and more spirited every day. Her once clumsy pounces had transformed into graceful leaps, and her curiosity about the savannah had become insatiable. Valentine marveled at her progress, but the weight of her future loomed heavily over him. "She's almost ready," Leo remarked one morning as he watched Serga chase a flock of guinea fowl across the open grasslands. "But are you?" Valentine frowned, shielding his eyes against the sun. "I'm not sure I'll ever be ready to let her go. But she deserves to live as she was meant to." It was a sprawling sanctuary, carved and tended to provide as close an approximation to nature as possible. Valentine had spent years transforming it into a haven for animals that couldn't survive in the wild. For Serga, it was the perfect training ground. Each day, Valentine pushed her a little further, teaching her the skills she'd need to survive on her own. Hunting proved the most difficult lesson. Serga's instincts were keen, but her timing was wrong, and she too often hesitated at the moment of truth. Valentine devised confidence-building exercises. He dragged a piece of meat attached to a rope along the ground, inviting Serga to pounce. At first, she approached with due circumspection, circling the moving target with ears laid back. With time, her attacks became much more assured. One afternoon, she managed to take down her first live prey, a small antelope. Valentine watched from a distance, his emotions conflicted. Pride swelled in his chest as he saw her instincts kick in, but the sight of her raw power reminded him of the danger she could face and pose in the wild. Leo clapped Valentine on the back, ever the optimist. "She's got it now. Look at her. She's a natural." Valentine nodded, his gaze fixed on Serga. "She's close. But she's not ready yet. Not completely." As Serga's training went on, Valentine increasingly clashed with Nigel Grayson. The land developer had plans to build luxury lodges near the park, which would upset the fragile balance of the ecosystem. It was no secret that Nigel held Valentine's work in disdain, and his arrogance often led to heated confrontations. "You're wasting prime real estate on a bunch of mangy animals," Nigel sneered during one such encounter. He stood on the edge of the park, his polished shoes kicking up dust. "Think of the revenue we could generate with a proper resort." Valentine's jaw tightened. "This land isn't for sale, Nigel. And he'll fight you every step of the way if you try to take it." Nigel's smirk widened. "You're fighting a losing battle, Marquez. Money talks, and I've got plenty of it." But Nigel's threats only seemed to strengthen Valentine's resolve regarding Serga. One evening, as they strolled through the park, the lioness suddenly stopped in her tracks, her ears swiveling toward a distant sound. Valentine followed her gaze and saw a group of hyenas prowling near the edge of the grasslands. Serga's growl rumbled low in her throat, but Valentine placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "Not yet," he murmured. "Let's see what they do." The hyenas, emboldened by their numbers, closed in. Serga's body tensed, her muscles coiled like springs. When one of the hyenas lunged, she reacted instinctively, charging forward with a roar that echoed across the savannah. The hyenas scattered, their laughter turning to panic yelps as Serga chased them into the distance. When she returned, her chest heaving and her tail swishing triumphantly, Valentine knelt beside her. "Good girl," he said, his voice filled with pride. You're stronger than they'll ever be. But Serga's strength and independence brought their challenges too. She started testing boundaries, moving further away from Valentine on walks, and sometimes ignoring his calls altogether. One afternoon, she disappeared for hours. The frantic Valentine was beside himself with worry. Finally returning, she carried the remains of a hair in her jaws, her expression one of quiet defiance. Hearing that incident, Leo couldn't hold it inside but burst out laughing, saying, "She's growing up, my friend. You cannot keep her on a leash all your life." "I know," Valentine admitted with the flick of a hand through his hair. "But it's like losing her." "You're not losing her," Leo said softly. "You're giving her the life she was meant to have. That's what makes you different from people like Nigel. You care about what's best for her, not what's easiest for you." When the dry season started to set in, Nigel escalated his efforts to claim the land. He launched legal challenges, planted false rumors about the financial stability of the park, and even tried to bribe local officials. Valentine responded with greater mobilization involving the community and conservationist groups, but the battle was wearing him down. One night, as Valentine sat by the fire with Serga resting at his feet, he confided in Leo. "I'm starting to wonder if it's all worth it. The park, the animals, this fight with Nigel. It feels endless." Leo's gaze was steady. "It's worth it, Valentine. Every life you've saved, every animal that's found safety here, is proof of that. And Serga? She's living proof that what you do matters." Valentine looked down at Serga, who stirred in her sleep, her paw resting lightly on his boot. In that moment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. No matter the obstacles, he would see this through for Serga, for the park, and for the countless lives that depended on him. Unbeknownst to Valentine, Nigel was devising the most underhanded of all moves yet. It wasn't the park that this land developer had been after but Serga. And now, there came a challenge that had never hit Valentine hard. The air grew heavier with tension as Valentine sensed that Nigel's interference was far from over. His suspicions were confirmed one crisp morning when he found tracks near the park's northern perimeter, deep tire ruts and boot prints that didn't belong to his team. Serga, now a towering and majestic lioness, stood beside him, sniffing the ground with visible agitation. Her ears swiveled back, and a low growl escaped her throat. "Easy, girl," Valentine murmured, stroking her head. "We'll handle this." He knew Nigel's tactics were becoming more aggressive, but this latest intrusion felt different. There was a boldness to it, a brazen disregard for the sanctity of the park. Valentine returned to his office and called Leo, whose voice on the other end of the line betrayed his own concern. "Tire tracks?" Leo repeated. "You think Nigel sent someone in?" "I don't think," Valentine replied grimly. "I know." Leo sighed. "All right. I'll head over with a few of the guys. We'll double-check the fences and see if we can find anything else." While Leo and the team were busy with the investigation, Valentine spent time training Serga. He was sure that she could feel his unease, and for both of them, the time spent in the savannah was soothing. Her hunting skills were now honed, and she moved with the silence of a born predator. Still, Valentine noticed something new in her behavior. She was becoming more protective, never leaving his side, bristling even at the slightest hint of danger. One evening, as they strolled along the edge of the park, Serga suddenly went still, her golden eyes riveted to a distant shape. Valentine followed her gaze and saw a figure hunched over near the fence, outlined against the sunset. His heart began to beat faster when he saw the intruder was cutting through the wire. "Stay here," Valentine whispered to Serga, though he had little doubt she'd comply with his demand. He approached cautiously, his boots crunching softly on the dry grass. When he was close enough to see the man clearly, Valentine called out, "That's far enough. Step away from the fence." The man startled but didn't run. Instead, he straightened and turned, a cocky grin spreading across his face. Valentine recognized him immediately, one of Nigel's lackeys, a wiry man named Carl who had a reputation for doing his boss's dirty work. "Just checking the property lines," Carl said, his tone dripping with mock innocence. "Didn't realize I'd crossed into your precious little zoo." Valentine's jaw clenched. You know exactly where you are. And you're trespassing. Carl shrugged. Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just doing my job. Your job doesn't involve cutting through my fence, Valentine retorted. Leave now, or I'll call the authorities. Carl raised his hands in mock surrender, taking a few backward steps. All right. No need to get worked up. I'm leaving. As soon as he disappeared into the distance, Valentine returned to Serga, who was pacing anxiously. He knelt beside her, his hand on her thick mane. It's all right, he said softly, though the knot in his stomach told him otherwise. We'll figure this out. The incidents continued to escalate over the following days. Traps near the waterholes were reported by workers, and various fences were found wrecked beyond repair. Serga grew increasingly restless, her instincts warning her of dangers that Valentine couldn't see. Like a sentry, she prowled the boundaries of the park, growling a warning to anyone daring to approach. Leo's frustration boiled over in a meeting with the team. Nigel's trying to scare you into giving up, he said. But if he thinks we're going to roll over, he's got another thing coming. Valentine nodded. We have to be vigilant. Serga's safety and the safety of every animal here depends on it. The breaking point came on a stormy night. In flashes of lightning, in short, jagged streaks, the savannah was illuminated as rain pounded upon the roof of Valentine's home. Serga, who had taken to sleeping near the door, suddenly bolted upright, ears pricked, muscles coiled like springs. What is it? Valentine asked, reaching for his flashlight. The large knight grunted loudly and charged outside into the storm before he could get up. Valentine picked up his coat and followed, running to keep up with her as she ran across the yard, his heart pounding in his chest. Rain blurred his vision, but he could see the outline of Serga as she ran toward the southern fence. By the time he did, she was standing over a man pinned to the ground, her massive paws holding him in place. The man was soaked and shivering, his face pale with terror. Valentine knew him on sight. Nigel, Valentine said, his voice dripping with disdain. Didn't expect to see you out here. Nigel stuttered, the bravado replaced by panic. See, call her off. She's going to kill me. Valentine crossed his arms. Serga doesn't attack unless she's provoked. What did you do? I was just looking around, Nigel lied, the darting of his eyes showing his deceit. I wasn't going to hurt anything. Valentine squatted beside him, his tone calm but firm. You've been sabotaging my park for weeks. Lying isn't going to save you now. Serga growled, her teeth bared inches from Nigel's face. He flinched, his arrogance crumbling. All right. I was trying to scare you off, okay? I wanted you to sell the land. Valentine stood, his gaze unyielding. You're lucky Serga has more restraint than you do. Get out. And if I see you here again, you'll be explaining yourself to the authorities. Nigel scrambled to his feet and fled, slipping and stumbling in the mud. Serga watched him go, her tail lashing behind her. When he was out of sight, she turned to Valentine, her eyes softening as he scratched behind her ears. Good girl, he said. You're my protector, aren't you? Although Nigel's threats had been neutralized for the moment, Valentine knew the fight was far from over. But as he walked back to the house with Serga by his side, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Together, they had faced down danger, and together, they would protect the sanctuary that had become their home. The night storm had left the wildlife park soaked, yet serene. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds and illuminated the savannah. Valentine stood on the porch of his home, looking out toward the horizon. Serga sat next to him, her amber eyes scanning the landscape as if she too was on high alert. Though Nigel had fled, Valentine knew the reprieve was temporary. Men like Nigel didn't take defeat easily, and Valentine suspected that his next move would be more calculated and dangerous. Days later, his fears were confirmed. Leo arrived at the park in a dust-covered truck, his face grim. Nigel's not done, he said, handing Valentine a folded newspaper. The headline read, Developer pushes for wildlife park shutdown over safety concerns. Valentine furrowed his brow as he read the article. Nigel had filed a formal complaint against them to the local government for having animals in the park that were a threat to living communities. The article was full of exaggerated accounts of animal escapes and mismanagement accusations that were as vague as they were undefined. "He's trying to turn the public against us," Valentine said, tight with anger. Leo nodded. "If he gets enough backing, he could force an investigation. Maybe even shut us down." With the need to counter the lies spread by Nigel, Valentine started a campaign showcasing how much the park mattered. Valentine and Leo arranged for community events where they let families come and have personal contact with the animals. Serga became the showstopper of all such gatherings, her docile nature and regal stance impressing the oncoming visitors. One such event drew a large crowd, including local journalists. Valentine stood before the gathering, his voice steady but impassioned. "This park isn't just a sanctuary for animals," he said. "It's a sanctuary for hope. Every creature here has a story of resilience, of overcoming adversity. Serga," he gestured to the lioness resting behind him, "is living proof of what can happen when we choose compassion over convenience." Applause exploded as Serga's low rumbling of approval sent tucks of laughter and cheering among the onlookers, while journalists snapped photos to reveal the bond between man and lioness. Despite the public's growing support, Nigel's campaign persisted. He hired lawyers to scrutinize every aspect of the park's operations, searching for any flaw he could exploit. One evening, as Valentine reviewed documents with Ellen, the park's legal advisor, a call came through that made his heart sink. "Valentine," Leo's voice crackled through the phone. "We've got a problem. Nigel's people cut the fence near the eastern boundary. Serga's out." Valentine's blood ran cold. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Don't let anyone else near her." The search for Serga was fraught with tension. The team split up, scanning the savannah with flashlights as night fell. Valentine's heart pounded as he called out for her, his voice carrying through the darkness. Finally, he heard a rustle in the tall grass. Turning his flashlight that way, he found Serga crouched over a figure sprawled on the ground. It was Carl, Nigel's lackey, his face pale and scratched from the encounter. "Get her off me," Carl whimpered, though Serga did not make any movement to hurt him. She only guarded, her body a barrier between him and the fence. Valentine approached cautiously, placing a hand on Serga's shoulder. "It's all right," he said softly. "You've done your job." Serga stepped back, allowing Valentine to pull Carl to his feet. "You've crossed the line," Valentine said, his voice cold. "Tell Nigel that if he wants a fight, he'll get one. But not like this." The next day, Valentine lodged his own complaints against Nigel, with proof of the sabotage and threats against the park. Public opinion swung firmly in Valentine's favor as news of Nigel's underhanded tactics spread. Community leaders, conservationists, and even local businesses rallied around the park, pledging their support. And so Nigel's empire began to crumble. The lawsuits drained him dry, while his reputation as a pitiless developer lost him allies. Meanwhile, Valentine's persistence and Serga's tale unleashed a wave of donations that ensured the park was there to stay. Months later, the park celebrated a victory with a festive outing. Families ambled down the trails, volunteers spoke about the animals, and Serga lapped up her admirers' attention. Valentine was at the center of the commotion. His heart was full to see Serga interacting with the children who came for her. Leo walked up, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Seems like we won," he said, handing one to Valentine. Valentine smiled, his eyes on Serga. "We didn't just win," he said. "We showed that fighting for what's right is worth every struggle." As the sun set over the park, Valentine sat with Serga under the shade of a baobab tree. She rested her massive head on his lap, her eyes closing in contentment. He ran his fingers through her mane, his thoughts drifting to the journey they had shared. "You've taught me more than I ever thought possible," he said in a quiet voice. "About strength, about loyalty, about what it means to fight for something you believe in." Serga rumbled softly, her way of saying she understood. The victory of the park was not just a defeat of Nigel, but of the bond that existed between humans and animals, reminding one that even the tiniest deed of kindness could grow into something special. And as Valentine and Serga watched the stars begin, they knew their story had only just begun.